Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Conversations on Anarres. I'm Dr. Joseph Orozco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for projects, conversations, and initiatives that imagine a future free of domination, exploitation, war, and empire. Here on Conversations on Anarres, we talk with scholars, activists, and artists about the possibilities of radical social transformation today. Our guest on our episode today is Dr. Randall Milstein. Dr. Milstein, you may have seen him, is a regular part of the Trek Wars at OSU Collective. So you've seen him on our channel talking about Star Wars and Star Trek and other science fiction franchises. But his official gig is astronomer in residence for Oregon's NASA Space Grant Consortium, located at Oregon State University. He is not a NASA employee, but he works regularly to further NASA's mission. We sat down to talk to him about whether there are any benefits to humanity from the billionaire space race. Dr. Milstein believes there are some pure scientific benefits that can come from this, though he acknowledges the criticisms that say that if these billionaires wanted to spend more money to alleviate problems on Earth, they certainly have enough money to do so, as well as to fund space travel. He doesn't see it as an either or. And in fact, we talk about what benefits space science has for bettering life on Earth. We also talk about the differences between space exploration and space colonization. And here, Dr. Milstein thinks that the aspirations for living in space need to be tempered by some reality. There is no planet B, and the hope for escaping a dying planet are pure science fiction fantasy. So, how can we continue to think about space science while acknowledging the very real problems of a deeply unequal and unjust world? Let's turn to our discussion with Dr. Randall Milstein about the billionaire space race. All right, well, we're here now with Dr. Randall Milstein. Dr. Milstein, welcome back to the program. We usually have you here for our Trek Wars at OSU program. Here you're now with our Conversations on Anarres program in one of your official responsibilities. So I want to thank you for your time, but welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me, Joseph. I always look forward to our discussions. It's always really educational for me, and it's also always a great time.
So, well, I thought it was a good opportunity to bring you in one of your official capacities to talk with us about some goings on in the world today, namely to talk here about this billionaire space race that's been going on. And so I wanted to bring you in quote unquote your official capacity, because you're your official title, or one of them amongst your many hats, right, is the astronomer in residence for Oregon's NASA Space Grant Consortium, which is housed at Oregon State University. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what that responsibility means. What's your role as part of that consortium at Oregon State for NASA?
Well, of course, my official duties at the university are to teach astronomy-related courses in the physics department and the University Honors College, and also Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. But my role as the astronomer in residence, and there are actually two of us. There is myself and another astronomer in residence, John Cowan, who is based out of Springfield, down in Southern Oregon. And what we do is help represent the consortium to anybody in Oregon, and even beyond that. During the eclipse, I actually happen to have on my old eclipse T-shirt today. Nice. I had to represent, Oregon's role and OSU's role and the space grants role in all the preparations that we were doing for the eclipse. Of course, that meant international interviews and national television and all kinds of crazy things like that. But John and I kind of split up our responsibilities, where he is an secondary school teacher, and so he deals a lot of times with primary and secondary school and outreach for that age group, and also service groups as well. And on the other hand, I tend to deal more with questions that come from, again, news agencies, sometimes private individuals, other universities and colleges, as government institutions maybe that come looking for information. And I will go out and do public engagement speaking with that, or to try to answer those questions for folks. I do a lot of things where newspapers call, or television or radio people call, and have an answer, for a question they have regarding space. So,
Okay. Are
uh,
so are you directly a NASA employee in any way?
no, I'm not actually. At the Space Grant Consortium, we have 4 people who are paid directly from NASA, and mine is a appointed role, and which I accept. But at the same time, I do go to our conferences and go to represent this consortium when we go to do things like that, and they're at NASA functions, Western Conference meetings, regional meetings, things like that as well.
I wanted to ask you your general view about this idea of this space race amongst the billionaires. Do you think that this space race is a good sign for the future of space travel science? And one thing, there's been a lot of criticism, of course, of the space race. So I wanted to ask you whether or not you think that this space race amongst these three individuals is a good thing for the kind of science that you teach and that you work in.
Yeah, this is of course my opinion. Of course, I'm not representing anybody, but yeah, I think it is, and maybe contra to what some of these other people are saying. But there's a different way to look at it than that. I know a lot of people were saying, well, they should take all that money they spend billions of dollars. Why aren't they using it to stop gun violence? Or, why aren't they doing it to climate change? These are very rich people. There's nothing that says they can't do both. And, it's their money. It's their interest in space because they see it as a future. It's an investment to them too. It's a money making possibility. These are, incredible capitalists and entrepreneurs. Um, they approach it differently. I think Branson is very different than Bezos. Bezos very different than Elon Musk and how they're approaching the space exploration. But there's this really good thing that's coming out of it is the reusability of the ships. And you have to remember, and I heard this described to me recently this way, is that we have to remember that when NASA goes into space, with the exception of the shuttles, but even their liftoff and stuff, once that was done, man, it was garbage.
Right,
It went
right.
into the ocean or, tumbled around space till it fell back in and burned up. It was one and done. And when you think about the fact that the US spent 5% of its national budget every year from when Kennedy said we were going to the moon until we landed and stopped in 72, just on going to the moon
Hmm.
and throwing that stuff away, that would be like, as it was described to me, you go to the grocery store, drive over in your car, buy groceries, put your groceries in the car, drive home, and then pull the car out on the road and set it on fire.
Right, right,
And the
right,
next time you want to go to the grocery store, you got to go buy a new car.
right.
All 3 of these people's space programs, Branson, Bezos, and Musk's, are reusable spacecraft. And that is a really huge technological step forward for that, and to be able to relaunch and then use that vehicle again and again
Right.
and do it safely. Why that's important, especially that landing stuff, is that we're not dumping stuff into the ocean. Where
Right.
in the past, we would always have our crafts land in the ocean with parachutes. And that brings its own safety hazards, and it requires the Navy or the Coast Guard to go out and get somebody, which is more money. And one of the things that these entrepreneurs are looking at is exploiting resources in space, whether from the moon or asteroids in the future. And this is really important because we have no way right now to bring any of that stuff back here. You can go and mine all the titanium you want on the moon, but you got to use it in space.
Right.
We have no way to bring it back to the surface. It just turns into basically a falling artificial asteroid, and we can't have that. That's too dangerous. But this technology of being able to land the craft safely, if you can get it big enough and enough
Hmm.
retro thrust, that may be usable in the future. And I think that's a really important step forward, and that's good science. I know that OSU is a pipeline for our aerospace engineers, both into SpaceX and into Blue Origin. And
Hmm.
we're famous for that 100% employment, I was told a couple of years ago, from our aerospace engineers.
Wow.
And the space grant here at Oregon State is very proud of the number of interns that we place with NASA as well every year. Catherine Lanier is responsible for that, and it's incredible the amount of students that are selected from OSU to be part of those programs. So
So
Oregon
you
has
would
got
say
something to be
that
proud of.
so you would say that part of the scientific developments that are going into these programs, there is something important out of this. You would counter the criticisms that we're wasting this money by saying if they really wanted to, they could spend a whole lot of other money on humanitarian prospects as well. So it's really about what their political will is. But it's not an either or. It could be a both and. It's just that they've chosen right now to focus on this space race, and from a scientific standpoint, good things could come of this.
Yeah, I mean, think of the good things that came out of the space race between the former Soviet Union and the United States. The technologies that we're able to do this Zoom meeting,
Right.
these computers, our cell phones, microwave ovens, the food stuffs, that came out of that space race is really important technology.
Yeah.
And it's always been said that for about every dollar that goes into taxes, about 1 penny goes to NASA. But the annual return is over $16 per penny. And that is a huge payback, you know, to civilization, and to an
Yeah.
economy,
So
so
this is
it's,
a question I want to explore with you in just a little bit about, what are the benefits of space science? But part of, I think, a lot of the hesitancy about the billionaire space race is that you and I talk a lot on in our different programs here on about science fiction, and science fiction for several decades has been priming us with stories about corporations in space, or corporations in general as the villains, right? If you think about cyberpunk in the 80s and 90s really sort of being part of this kind of movement of thinking about corporation and corporate entities as villains. But you go to Avatar, you go to Aliens, right? The big villains in all of these films are
the
corporate.
expanse.
The Expanse too, right? One of my favorite shows, right? They're all sort of posed as kind of these villainous forces in space societies. So I was wondering if you think that I know that you are an aficionado of sci-fi. I was wondering if you think that we've been primed to be suspect of these kinds of efforts of corporate space travel. Or is there really some kind of problem with entrusting space exploration to private entities rather than to something like a national space program such as NASA?
Well, I know that in the last several years, NASA has come out and said what they look at is allow private business to kind of exploit that low Earth orbit environment, whether it's putting satellites up or running people up and back to a space station of some kind. But that NASA and say the European Space Agency would be another example, or JAXA would be dealing with deep space initiative.
Mm.
That means to the moon and beyond, and deal with things like that. And I think some of that is rooted in how we look at humans going into space. I
Mhm.
know NASA traditionally has a position where you got to be down in the less than 4%, like 3% chance that something could go wrong before you're going to send a human being into space. Currently, they feel like they're in the 14% range. So they're not really willing yet to do that on NASA's time. But Musk feels that they're safe enough in these, journeys they're doing now is almost like space tourism. It's proving to be safe in low Earth orbit. So let them deal with that. We do use one of Musk's rockets to take people up to the ISS. And that's, I think, a good thing. And also, we know that when the last administration, not the Biden administration, but the Trump administration came in, one of the first things they did was do a cost benefit analysis of how much space exploration was costing versus what's the return.
Mhm.
And you look at that and you say, that's really nefarious. This is, Trump trying to exploit something. But the bottom line is no, if your tax dollars are going to pay for something, people want to know what is the return for this.
Right.
Now, for me, the pure science is awesome. I'll take
Right.
all the science I can get.
Right.
But people are going, well, why do we need to go back to the moon? What's the purpose? Well, if you can say, well, the moon is rich in titanium, the Earth is not. We have the possibility for H2 there to run a hydrogen economy that can come from the moon, because we don't have that ability here. It's very expensive to get hydrogen fuel cells here. Then there is the tactical point as well. If you put a space station at the south pole of the moon, the way the moon is canted in its orbit, you have a tactical overlook of the entire planet Earth.
Right.
So if you have your observations there, or even as something as awesome as maybe putting a solar collector that can then put microwave energy back to Earth
Yeah.
and collect it solar wise, that's really cool. But that's the commanding position, is that southern hemisphere of the moon. And so there's also lots of ice water there. We're in a water situation here.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we have no way to bring that stuff back here. But if we can exploit it there to make rocket fuel, it's a lot easier to go from the moon with low gravity forces on you for a trip to Mars or to Venus. You could build a shelter and have a permanent base there. It has its own problems, of course, with solar radiation and things like that. And there's some health issues being on the moon with 1/6 the gravity, and no way to shield yourself really from that radiation. But yeah, there's a reason for that. It doesn't have to be nefarious. It's saying, okay, we're making a major investment here. What is our goal back from
Well,
that?
this is part of the question I have too. Is you mentioned the sort of collaboration between SpaceX and sending astronauts to the ISS. Is there a question about who owns this science or these technological developments when they are arrived at by these private space programs? Is there any kind of worry about the proprietary science? Who owns it and who controls it if it's
Well,
being done by private entities like
they're
this?
all patented. All that stuff they invent is patented. It's theirs.
Hmm.
And, NASA does a similar thing, except that there's a book that comes out. I just received one about a month ago that they put out every year with all the technology, both softwares and hardwares, that NASA produces for a year. And anybody's welcome to go get one of those books. And you can contact NASA and say, listen, I got a really cool idea. And using this piece of software you got, what are the steps I need to do to use this? NASA says, well, you fill out this form and you give it to us. If you invent something cool, let us know. We can help you push a patent through in record time. And we only want 2%. At least that's what it used to be,
Hmm.
which is the best deal you're going to get, if you're sharing technologies. But your tax dollars already paid for that. So they
Hmm.
say, here, we're sharing it with everybody. Anybody can use it. And I've seen some incredible things done with that stuff, from making baby formula more nutritious to tracking animals without having to put collars on them, to all kinds of cool stuff. But Musk stuff that's his technology. Branson,
Mhm.
that's Blue Origin's technology. Branson's Virgin Galactic, that's their stuff. And they have the right to then exploit that in any way that they choose. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, some of the ideas they have I would question, but
Well, so this brings a question. I know that we've talked about this before. That I want you sort of brought up about the dangers of space exploration and space colonization, right? Um, Musk and Bezos have both said that they think their work is important because it opens up the way for human beings to start thinking about the colonization of space, either on the moon or on Mars, right? Which has been sort of like this point for both of them. And there's been a lot of criticism of them for this kind of view that we ought to go to Mars, because the view is, look, we can barely take care of the Earth. The Earth is, burning up and going to hell in a handbasket, and these guys want to spend all their money going to someplace else that seems really dangerous. And it's not clear if it's realistic to spend all this money thinking about trying to get to Mars. Are the worries about whether or not that this is realistic enough serious ones that we ought to take into account? Like, in your estimation, uh, are critics being realistic about the possibilities of humanity in space in the next few decades?
I hate to use the word, but a lot of it's kind of delusional. There are some really fundamental things that if any of these Imagineers or dreamers, whatever they are, you want to call them, like Musk, somebody needs to sit down and really explain the science to them, I think.
Mm.
This idea, we're going to go make Mars a new Eden. Oh,
Yeah.
it's going to be great. We're going to have an atmosphere. It's going to be wonderful, growing potatoes and all kinds of stuff. Can't happen. It defies the physics. It defies the fundamental geology of those locations, and it defies human physiology. We have to remember we've been around maybe as Homo sapiens, say, what, 3 million years or something like that, or in there somewhere. And that's not very much time evolutionarily, but we've developed to live on this planet with this gravity, with this much moisture, with a magnetic field and an atmosphere that protects us from solar radiation. We know how vulnerable we are to UV radiation and cosmic rays.
Mm.
Very dangerous to us. And we're, of course, trashing the planet to the point now where it's a couple degree temperature change is enough to harm us. We also have to remember there's only one species of human beings.
Mm.
If something takes us down, whether it's a virus or heat, that's it. Sun's still going to come up tomorrow on the planet. Planet's going to be fine.
Yeah.
But we saw what happened to the dinosaurs. They were around for 165 million years being the boss. You go to a place like Mars, no water, no oxygen, extremely cold, extremely hot, no atmosphere at all, no magnetic field. You go to Mars and you die. That's end of the story. And its gravity is 1/3 of Earth's. So your morphology of your body and your physiology cannot tolerate that. You cannot have a colony, quote, a growing colony. You're going to want to have kids there. You cannot have a child in that situation. A woman's human physiology cannot deal with that. The child could not either. And so that would be very, very dangerous. Same thing on the moon. And again, if I want to go to a cold, waterless, rock, I can go to the moon. It's 2 days away. Don't need to go 4 months to Mars, get stuck there for 2 years, and hopefully be able to leave and come back 4 months later. Because if not, you're done. But the trips there and that back, it's basically a death sentence right now. And it's really a simple scientific thing about this. You cannot have a planet that you want to go and be around and survive without an atmosphere for us. That's something we would have to have.
Right.
Of course, Venus is toxic, but Mars used to have water, could be okay. But you have to have a magnetic field to protect that atmosphere so the solar wind does not sweep it away. Well, to do that, that means you have to have a very special kind of planet. It has to have an iron nickel core. It has to have some liquid rock left that involves convection currents to make an electric charge to have a magnetic field. Okay, Mars is a solid rock pretty much.
Mm.
Its surface area is so small, half of Earth's, and it had some events that took place in its history that allowed big volcanoes to outgas and release heat. Guess what? No more geodynamo to make that magnetic field. No magnetic field. Solar wind sweeps the atmosphere away by photodissociation, and it's done. Nothing you're going to do is going to make that come back.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
You can't recharge and remelt the interior of some planet, and make that work. It just is not possible. And
yeah, when I hear these stories of like the colonization of Mars or even of the moon, and these, I think about that. There's this one line David Brin, the science fiction writer, has. He says there's a story for that, and my favorite sort of story about this kind of stuff is Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, which is a story about a human colonization effort. It's a sort of a sleeper ship that goes out into interstellar space to try to find another planet. And the story, the spoilers, it's mostly about how it's going to be really impossible for human beings to find a hospitable planet in which we will be able to live, because in the story they find this planet, I don't know how many light years away. They finally get there and they realize that what they thought was going to be something that human beings could live on turns out that is totally inhospitable. The atmosphere kills us within seconds. And then we're stuck sort of thinking about like, well, what do we do now? Where do we go? And in the end, right, a group of them decide, let's go back to Earth. And the group that goes back to Earth sort of creates this dawning awareness that there is no planet B. There is nowhere else to go. It's here for us as human beings. And in the stories, Robinson has, yeah, we do start to live, in the solar system in different places, but it turns out that every 6 months or so, human beings have to come back to the Earth for health reasons, because long-term habitation outside of the Earth causes all these kinds of health problems in human beings. And so part of the story for Robinson is to sort of say, look, we need to take care of the Earth. The sort of New Eden dream of making some other planet for us is not going to work out, because, like, as you said, we've adapted, we've evolved to be here. And if we are going to live somewhere else, we're going to be very different creatures. And so we're going to have to think about something else. So, then we started getting into transhumanism or something or other. But the idea that we, Homo sapiens sapiens, are going to be living on Mars or even on the moon in a healthy kind of way without the Earth, is a fantasy.
Well, it's kind of interesting too, this whole thing about going to Mars, because NASA does have the outlines of an exploration program for Venus called Project Havoc. And Venus is closer, number one, and number two, you could do it by putting a space station in orbit. Same thing with Mars. There's no reason to go to the surface. Just put a space station in orbit and run your remotes in real time rather than the delayed time we have now. But on Mars, or excuse me, on Venus, they're thinking about putting the space station around it, and then having the ability to go down to lighter than air ships, dirigibles. And if you're about, I don't know, 50,000 feet or 6,000 feet in the Martian atmosphere, you're still got many thousands of feet of atmosphere above you. It's so dense and so thick there. So it filters all that solar radiation. And at that height, the pressure is similar to being at about 15 to 20,000 feet on Earth. So you could take your spacesuit off inside the dirigible and be just fine. Temperature be in the 70-degree range. And you could extract chemistry from Venus's atmosphere, even though it normally is toxic. You could do it and extract oxygen and water. So that would be kind of a more interesting stepping stone, and it'd be probably cheaper to do that as well. The problem is you can't stick a flag on the surface of Venus.
Right.
And then you get into the politics and the mindset of that. But another point about this whole thing about these guys wanting to go out and colonize these worlds, one of the questions I don't think gets asked very often is who exactly is going to get to go.
Right.
Because if these private corporations and fairly wealthy people, and they're worried about something rotten happening on our planet, it's only going to be fairly wealthy people who that they vet get to go.
Right.
You and I wear eyeglasses. I wouldn't think that they would be vetting us to go.
Right.
So who exactly is going to get to do this? And we look at what happened last year when the United Arab Emirates made out a statement that they said by, was it 2035 or 2040, they wanted to have 600,000 people on a colony on Mars, which financially and technologically just is kind of science fiction-y. But the first thing that happened after that came out was this great hoo-ha. I mean, a bunch of people just screaming and ranting and raving. And it was totally anti-Islam feelings. They said we can't let that happen, because that would mean that Mars would be an Islamic country.
Right.
Or an economic world. And I was just like, what are you talking about? Yeah. That is the level of bigotry and hatred in a statement like that just stopped me in my tracks. As if a planet cares what a person's faith is. But apparently there are people who want to raise a stink about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that raises a lot of questions. I mean, one of the, speaking about science fiction again, one of the universes that I think is really interesting about what space exploration will do to identities is something like The Expanse, where what happens is that rather than having these kinds of divisions between, for instance, faith or ethnicity, right? It turns into planets, right? Are you an Earther? Are you from Mars, or are you from the Belt? And the same sort of hostilities and discrimination and oppression start to take place with new identities. So human beings are no longer worried about people's faith. It becomes now a question of where you are in the solar system and how that affects you. So we always find some ways, according to the Expanse, to sort of divide and conquer one another. So that's a kind of a dystopian, worrisome thing, but it takes sort of account different ways in which historically our identities have shifted and changed, but our tendency to want to be tribal in one way or another remains. And it's not clear that moving into space is necessarily going to alter or shift these historical tendencies or not.
Yeah, and
So we have to worry about that.
you see that in the Firefly universe as well,
That's
with
right.
the Blue Sun Corporation, which is this amalgam American Sino thing
Right.
that's it's become a political force because of its economic power, and that they've basically got whole parts of whatever the solar system is in that universe that it's basically a peasant world.
Right.
There's
Right.
this, people are kept in serfdom to this massive corporation.
Right.
And again, you see some similarities of that in the Expanse as well with the Belters.
Right, right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot to sort of think about historical patterns of colonization, whether those will continue on as we talk in these new dreams about colonization of
Well,
Venus, Moon, or Mars.
think of Musk and Bezos, and especially Amazon being so huge, and then think of the East India Corporation.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was thinking last night when I was thinking about this interview. Is that when you think about the colonization of quote unquote the New World or the Americas, it was done by private corporations in this kind of way, investors putting money in to send a few people to explore, right? And so the patterns of historical Earth colonization followed this kind of private entity model. Well, so I mean, this raises this question then for me. We've talked about whether it's worth it from a science standpoint. Stuff like this is always worth it, I guess, for the generation of science and new technology, new ideas. Um, we have to be worried about what is realistic. We have to worry about whether or not we're carrying with us certain kinds of historical tendencies that could turn really bad in space. Um, what do you think should be the focus of space programs going forward? Because I heard an interesting interview last week, in reaction to the launch of Bezos into space. A radio program was interviewing someone who is a consultant with the Nigerian Space Agency, and they're talking about Africa's sort of aspirations for space. So there have been a variety of different African nations that in the past, say, 20 years have launched numerous satellites into orbit. And so the consultant made a really interesting distinction to me that I thought was interesting, was that there's a difference between space exploration as a goal and then using space as a resource and thinking about the science for using space as a resource for Earth. And the difference with something like this, there's a difference between going to the moon. There's a difference between then going to Mars. This idea of exploring, which is tied to colonization, versus what the African space agencies have been doing, is thinking about how to get satellites into orbit so that they can have better internet connectivity, so that their satellites can do better GPS tracking for rescue or for wildlife conservation. Right. And so a lot of African nations have been thinking about space as one sort of technological advancement that's going to help their societies on Earth. So instead of thinking about like how do we get to the next planet or so forth, they're thinking about space science as something that's useful for improving human life on Earth. And so I'm wondering whether or not what you think about this kind of distinction between space exploration and space science as a resource for Earth. Is there a distinction, or does it make sense to make a difference between these different kinds of goals?
Yeah, I think it does. I think a really great example is what happened back in 2016, 2017, excuse me, when one of the first things of the previous administration did was, set up a bunch of rules where they didn't want NASA satellites and things to be looking back at Earth and gathering the data that would say, hey, we got a problem with climate change here. We got a problem with melting glaciers. I mean, it became a political issue of, this one administration wanted to turn off all that data. They didn't want, to let them do anything they didn't want to do that was bust down rules and stuff. On the other hand, Nigeria says, no, that's what we want to use that data for. So it becomes a matter of politics rather than good or bad science. And I don't know, for me as a scientist, that's really frustrating. All he wants the data. We can't make decisions. The purpose of science is to define reality in a consistent manner. And reality is important, very important, especially for our survival. And so that data that can come from those explorations of our planet, or put those satellites up there, or what we can learn by going to Mars, say, this is what happens when the planet goes bad. Do you want that happening here? We know what runaway greenhouse gas can do because we can look at Venus.
Right.
And we can do the math, and we know what the different chemistries of those atmospheres are, and what it would take to get us to that point, which isn't a lot. And so we have to be very mindful of those things. And you can't define that reality without the data. There are some downsides with putting all that. There's about 500,000 objects in orbit around the Earth that are reported. There's probably more that are secret. And, all these CubeSats that are going up all the time, and that's great, but you're going to end up with so much stuff orbiting the Earth that it's going to become hard to leave Earth.
Right.
And not fly through this. This bunch of junk. I mean, there is, I think it was 440,000 pounds of garbage on the moon. And we only ever went there 6 times. And
wow.
of those, there are 96 containers of human excrement, urine, and vomit that we left there. So we pretty much made it a dump.
Yeah.
First thing, that's our gift to the moon, is we go and we make it a dump. Again, we can't take care of where we live. Why do we have the right to go somewhere else and mess that up? But like I said, the science we get back, when the James Webb Telescope comes into operation in the next couple of years, I think that that's going to really open people's eyes. It's going to make a universe really big for a lot of people.
Could you explain what that is?
Well, the James Webb Telescope is the replacement telescope for the Hubble. Hubble's been having some problems technologically, and it's old. It's 20-some years old. And the James Webb will be about 100 times better resolution than the Hubble. And it will be also imaging in the infrared spectrum, the longest wavelengths of light that we're dealing with. And as a result of that, it will allow us to see farther back into the history of the universe,
right,
because it will be sensitive to those red-shifted light waves. And that is going to push back what we refer to as the cosmic light horizon, the observable universe, the boundary. The farthest we can see now is about, 13.8 billion years or something of light travel time. It will push that way beyond that, and we'll be able to have a new age for the universe and see objects farther beyond. And I think that it's very important philosophically for people to understand that we live in a really big universe. There's a lot of people who like to live in a very tiny universe. It feels very secure to them. They like to have one answer for all their questions. But it certainly limits their ability to be visionary, to solve problems.
Well, I mean, I think that this was right. This was Carl Sagan's the blue dot idea.
I have a copy of it sitting right down here 3 feet from me.
Right, this whole idea that once you see the Earth from that standpoint, right, there's a shift of perspective in terms of your priorities and what you think about. I mean, I guess to his credit, in some sense, right, Branson did say that his trip into space made him start to think about thinking about climate change and environmental issues, and that this is something that needs to be taken seriously. So he claims that seeing the Earth from space made him feel that there are some social, political, environmental issues that need to be tackled, and that this was something that was occasioned by his space travel. So whether or not he does anything about that will be a key element. I think there was, this is the interesting thing. We've talked about this. It's a question about the political will that we have as societies and as these individuals to trying to figure out like how do we use this science to help human flourishing, and in what ways is this going to help human beings flourish. And I think that there's a lot of questions about how we do our spending priorities, but from the pure science standpoint, you're saying this can really make a difference for thinking about how we think about our world, how we think about ourselves, and understanding our place in the universe is really key to being able to answer those political kinds of questions.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be balance that too. I mean, we had someone who launched a car into space, and his whole purpose was to smash it into Mars. Um,
Right.
Mars is still, we think, a fairly pristine environment. We try to sterilize all of our spacecraft, at least that NASA sends before they go out. We don't want to contaminate someplace, kind of the prime directive thing from Star Trek.
Right.
That's why we don't go searching in places where there's water, we suspect, on Mars. Um, for us, water means life. We follow the water to look for living things. If our spacecrafts, our rovers, were not totally sterile, they could cause a problem. And then we have someone whose idea was to smash a car into the surface with, air in the tires that could be contaminated. I don't know what kind of fluids are in an electric car, but stuff is definitely trapped in the seats, spare tires, the grease in the axles for changing a spare tire. If I can't remember if the batteries were in that car or not, but if they were, those batteries are toxic.
Right.
Um, so that would have been a real environmental tragedy to have that thing have struck Mars. So again, it becomes the values that are being expressed by the people who are involved in these things. And it's not just private individuals, in businesses, but it can be governments as well, whatever
Yeah.
their reasons for going are. And nobody has classes in space ethics.
Yeah.
We have signed all these treaties in the last 50 or 60 years about exploitation in space. 100 and I don't know, 40 countries have signed on to these about you can't go out and exploit for a single use purpose. It has to be shared internationally. Um, and yet, last year, when this whole, or 2 years ago, when the whole idea of going back to the moon came about, all of a sudden there was this thing called the Artemis Accords that they were talking about. That would be a whole set of rules that say, no, well, if you go there to the moon, you'll have an exclusionary zone,
Oh, interesting.
and that no one else is allowed in your exclusionary zone. They can't ask questions, they can't take anything out, or any of these companies that go to the surface of the moon maybe and bring back rocks all have to be sold back to NASA. They have sole proprietary rights of it. Um, that no one's allowed into your exclusionary economic zone in other countries. Well, the fact that it's exclusionary and you're not sharing breaks all those other accords that you already signed before.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, there's some things going on that would break some previously existing treaties, and so it's going to be interesting to see how that's handled. I need to do some more reading on that, but that was my understanding up until like 2 months ago.
Right. So a lot of these space treaties depend then on what the current kind of geopolitical powers of the world are at the moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, like the politics of whatever your country is,
Yeah.
and what your respect or disrespect for science is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing about this, and we sort of start to wrap this up is I saw an interesting another meme about space exploration today. Someone was saying, why is it that we say that the United States won the space race because we were the first ones to get to the moon? When you start to look at sort of highlights of space exploration, the Soviet Union was hitting all the benchmarks beforehand, and it was getting first people into space, all these kinds of things. Right, the Soviet Union beat the United States all up until we got to the moon, and yet there's this kind of triumphant notion that we are the ones that are leading space exploration, but it wasn't really true in that glory days of NASA. And so, is there a kind of propaganda element even too with national space programs in terms of what they can accomplish? Do they also put further political goals in these kinds of ways?
Oh, sure. We always have to remember that a lot of, NASA science is awesome, and it's been wonderful for our country and the world as a whole. But it always has a political mission.
Yeah.
It has from day one, from 1958. Yeah, we were getting beaten. We got beat up and down the whole line for 20 some years. They were always Soviet Union was always ahead of us in everything, except landing the moon. And if you're the winner and you get to the moon first, and you think that's the goal, and you've convinced everybody that that's the goal, then you can, you know, mold the message. We
Yeah.
won.
Yeah.
Well, was the Soviet Union trying to get to the moon? I don't remember that being one of their goals. They were trying to make
Right.
orbital space stations and stuff. And so if you say that's the goal and then you do it, and it's interesting to show students when we talk about the history of space exploration in astronomy that you have these pictures that were promoted on Life magazine, Look magazine, and the Soviet Union did them. And they'd have these pictures of the astronauts and cosmonauts that made them look like movie stars.
Hmm. Hmm.
They would have headings like "The Making of a Brave Man." That was one of the Life magazine titles. They were portraying them as these heroic
Yeah.
figures, and in this struggle, the Cold War, and then I tell the students, will ask, well, why did, we had all these great ships, so why didn't we go back to the moon
Hmm.
again after 72? And I said, well, one, we got there, we went there 6 times, whatever it was, and we got some rocks, and we didn't need to go back. We won. We put a flag on the moon, it says United States,
Yeah.
and that was the big advertising message that we
Yeah.
did it, and we didn't want to keep spending 5% of our national budget on it. It was 440,000 employees were involved, across the country to send people to the moon. That's
Yeah.
a huge chunk, 500,000 people almost involved in one project. But that's a lot. We won. We
Yeah.
say we won. We won. End of story. Go
Yeah.
do something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it goes back to reinforce our question is that, the science is important, but it's tied up in this kind of nexus of political decision making and power. And it also, filters into our national consciousness in different kinds of ways. The one way I think about this often is, I'm a big Star Trek fan.
Oh, you
Uh,
really? You?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The opening montage for Star Trek Enterprise in the early 2000s, right? A lot of people turn this off because they hate the opening song, which I do too. Actually, I don't like that the Enterprise theme song, but the opening credit scene um, is this series of technological developments from rafts to sailboats, all these ships that have been named Enterprise. And you start to they show the space shuttle and then moving on through the history of space travel, and all of them are American astronauts. Right, and so from this science fiction show, you get the sense that it was the United States that got from there were these rafts, it got to sailboats, and then there was the aircraft carrier Enterprise and the space shuttle, and then finally the USS Enterprise of Star Trek, like this continuous line of progress that came from the U.S. Space Agency, and it's just a really interesting kind of American propaganda about what the space race was about in the 1960s. That simply was just not the case. It wasn't the case that the United States was at the forefront about a lot of this.
No, they were behind in everything from who they launched, the sex of the people that were launched, living things that were launched, the
Right.
satellites that were launched.
Yeah.
One or two people launched at the same time. They beat us there too. First in space, walking in space, that was them too.
Right.
A space station, they did that too.
Right.
So,
Yeah. No, it's interesting. So, I mean, I think that I like the point that you made is that there needs to be a question about the space ethics involved in all of this, especially now that we're on this kind of brink of opening this up for commercial use. What is this all going to mean for science, but also for our other political priorities?
yeah, because it would be very easy to have that control in space and then use that to oppress people who don't have the access to that technology.
Right.
And anything, like I said, you could very easily put solar reflectors in space and move that energy, you know, it's costing you nothing from the sun other than your investment of getting it up there as microwaves back to the earth and in collectors. And I know at JAXA, Japanese Space Agency, is involved in this kind of project. Um, but you could see that would be really helpful for people in Africa who don't have access to those kind of technologies right now, other than that they've been giving people solar panels, which is cheaper.
Right.
But those kind of things would be very helpful for a lot of people. But if you have it and it's your industry and your patent, and you're not going to share it or charge people a lot to have it, what did we gain?
Yeah. 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 No, I think that's a good question, and that's a good point to sort of start wondering about. Right. Well, I think that's a good point to sort of end on, to think about the need for our political and ethical priorities in space exploration. Dr. Milstein, I want to thank you for your time and sharing your perspectives on the billionaire space race and what might be possible from it. So thanks again for showing up, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you again in other ways on our programs here. But thanks for your time.
Well, I'm always glad to be here. And I want to mention, too, that a lot of the things that I think about when it comes to these things are ideas that are from questions from my students.
Right. Right.
And I think it's very important. They're the younger generation. They're going to have to deal with this stuff as things go forward. And the very fact that they're thinking about them and they're thoughtful about them and they are concerned about the ethical questions that are arising from this, I think speaks very well.
Yeah, I have to
for young
agree. I
people.
mean, in my own classes, when I teach questions about space exploration, usually in the context of Star Trek, my students are always have some really strong debates about whether or not this is worthwhile. I have a lot of folks who are particularly Elon Musk boys. I have a lot of young men who are very much into SpaceX and what Elon Musk's vision of going forward. But a lot of people always asking, like, what are we getting out of this? What are we going to accomplish? And how is it going to be shared for the benefit of everybody? So I think that you're absolutely right that our students are thinking about this, and I'm pleased to see that going on in my classes as well.
Now, I always say the very best part of our job, at least for me, is that I learn something new every day,
Right.
and that I almost invariably learn it from my students.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's good. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Dr. Milstein. I appreciate your time, and I hope to have you back very soon. And I thank all of you for tuning in and sharing your time with us. Let us know your thoughts if you have any kinds of thoughts or questions or opinions about the billionaire space race and the benefits of space exploration for humanity. Leave us a comment, send us a thought. You can find us at the Anarres program at our website, the Anarres program, anarresproject.org. And you can also find us at Anarres Project and all the socials on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, and you can also listen to our audio podcasts on anchor.fm. So thanks once again, Dr. Milstein. Take care. Live long.
Thank you, Joseph. Live long and prosper. Peace and long life. Excuse me. Peace and
Very
long
good.
life.
Good job.
Cheers.